Mary Jane, ganja, cheese, green, herb, grass, and bud. There are many names for this peculiar plant, and its history is almost just as varied. However, it seems that most people's understanding of this plant's past is filled with myths, urban legends, and in some cases, outright bullshit. This is why I have attempted on this most significant of days to pierce through some of the haze surrounding the topic, and provide you with the story behind the drug. And so, without further ado, here's a history of marijuana. Our story starts in the Central Asian steppe, where the vast expanses of uninterrupted grasslands, coupled with its hot and relatively dry climate, provided an ideal habitat for the marijuana plant to thrive. We see their emergence in the fossil record about 27.8 million years ago, probably around the time that it diverged from its sister genus Humulus. The first recorded evidence we have of humans using the plant is from 8000 BC, where we see the remnants of the plant occur close to known human settlements, such as in that of the Oki Islands close to Japan, thus making it one of the first crops humanity took the pain to cultivate. Unfortunately, we cannot reliably conclude that our species has been getting high 4,500 years before we even invented the wheel. It is much more probable that they noticed its fast-growing properties and exploited it for clothes and rope. The earliest pieces of convincing evidence we have of humans using marijuana's psychoactive properties is actually where we started, in Central Asia, more specifically the Pamir Mountains. Here, archaeologists have found an obstinate residue of burnt marijuana in bowls excavated from the Chizinkal cemetery. Using carbon dating, they dated it back to 2,500 years ago, and concluded that it was probably used for funeral rituals. The subsequent spread of marijuana being used as a drug is quite unclear, possibly something to do with the fact that the people using the psychoactive substance were probably in no mood to make detailed documents as to how they obtained it and from whom they had the tradition passed on from. However, we do have some patches to work with. For example, we know that the fierce nomadic warriors of Scythia use the drug in certain rituals, as well as for whenever they just want to get high. Indeed, even the supposed founder of history, Herodotus, writes about how the elusive substance makes the Scythians, quote, howl in their joy at the vapor bath, end quote. From the 5th century BC, the next substantial patch we find comes from the Middle East. Here, anthropologists have noticed a correlation between the spread of Islam after 800 AD and the appearance of descriptive accounts ranging from Iraq to Egypt. This has led some anthropologists to argue that Islam was a major proponent in the eventual prevalence and popularity of marijuana throughout the world. To bolster this claim, they draw upon the fact that, unlike alcohol, marijuana is not specifically prohibited in the Quran. Indeed, there are rare surviving accounts of marijuana being spread throughout the courts of the Islamic world, such as during the reign of Caliph al-Mustansir Bi'Ela, when a royal court in what is now Iraq was introduced to marijuana by the entourage of the visiting rulers of Bahrain. In an almost ironically similar fashion to the early Muslims, when in 1798 Napoleon Bonaparte's troops invaded Egypt, they found that there was no alcohol to be had, with Egypt being a Muslim country. Therefore, in lieu of alcohol, Bonaparte's troops resorted to trying the hashish, prevalent in Egypt at the time. They found this to be very much to their liking, so much so that Napoleon actually had to put a ban on it. By the 19th century, the enduring effects of marijuana were known throughout the old world of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Moreover, in plentiful parts of Africa and Asia it was in common use. However, the peak of colonialism around this time was both further its spread, as well as started its repressive prohibition, as the two unfortunately proved to be inexorably linked. During the early 1800s, the Portuguese intended to cultivate hemp fiber, but the slaves the Portuguese imported from Africa were familiar with cannabis, and so used the plant, leading to the municipal council of Rio de Janeiro in 1830 to prohibit bringing cannabis into the city and punishing its use by any slave. Similarly, the British practice of transporting Indian indentured workers throughout the empire had the result of spreading their long-standing cannabis practices. In attempts to minimize the visibility of this unforeseen consequence, the British banned the use of marijuana in Mauritius in 1840, in Singapore in 1870, and in South Africa also in the same year. The subsequent worldwide prohibition of marijuana can really only be done well with a much longer video solely dedicated to the subject. So for the purposes of this video, I'll focus on America, since for most of the 20th century, a theme that has frequently reoccurred is that whatever America does, the rest of the world follows suit. In the early 1600s, King James I ordered that the marijuana plant, more specifically its low THC cousin hemp, to be grown in every farm in Virginia, to then be exported back to England for the manufacture of clothes and rope. However, it didn't catch on as a recreational drug, probably something to do with the hardcore religious puritanism many of the first inhabitants of America sported. This was become very apparent in 1910, when large swaths of Mexican migrants fleeing the revolution in their homeland flooded the already saturated American labor market in the South. Unsurprisingly, they were not welcome, and so their habit of smoking marijuana recreationally became inexorably intertwined with the xenophobic and anti-immigrant attitudes prevailing in the nation at the time. This gave the drug a mysterious and sinister perception in the American psyche, not too dissimilar from the perception they held for the migrants. For a sample of the American public perception of marijuana at the time, look no further than The Reefer, an almost hilariously bigoted film from 1936 about the effects of marijuana, which apparently include tendencies to commit suicide, rape, and murder. These completely unsubstantiated perceptions leaked into law in 1937, when Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act, which imposed a heavy tax on the medicinal sale of marijuana and completely banned its possession and selling for recreational purposes. Unfortunately, the motif of xenophobia and racism being called with marijuana's prohibition is a prevailing one in American history, as the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, passed by Richard Nixon's administration, proved once again. Under this law, marijuana became a Schedule I drug, putting it in the same tier of drugs as heroin and cocaine, and thus making the act of merely possessing it a crime worthy of jail time. The reason for why this law was passed is best explained by Richard Nixon's Chief Domestic Affairs Advisor, John Ehrlichman. Quote, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." In the present, we have come a long way in our understanding of marijuana's effects and medicinal properties relative to 1970. This has paved the way for many countries such as Canada, South Africa, and Uruguay to completely legalize the drug, and even more countries such as Australia, New Zealand, and Brazil to legalize it for medical purposes. Even now in America, 9 states have completely legalized marijuana, and an additional 29 states have allowed marijuana's use for medical purposes. This has in turn finally opened the gate for scientists to conduct long overdue research into marijuana. I guess all one can hope for is that scientific research continues to expose the consumption of marijuana's damaging consequences, as well as unveil its ever more apparent benefits.